On Amazon, you can find my book on how intelligence networks created and cultivated the traditional conspiracy mythology. This is a very new field of research. I have been working on this since 2017. Professor Klaus Oberhauser from Austria released his own study a few years ago. More than 200 years after the genre was born, we can still unravel the networks and operations behind it. Normally, only weird social scientists deal with this topic, mostly left-wing people. They debunk the most obvious stuff and call it a day. They lack the understanding of the intelligence world and the history of empires. And they want to create the impression that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the West today. Unfortunately, the advent of modern science and the Enlightenment did not end the multi-thousand-year history of ruthless imperialism. Instead, imperialism became smarter, less visible, and could finally build huge armies and weapons of mass destruction. Instead of using the aristocracy itself as the single ideology that everybody had to accept, new ideologies were formed. We saw half monarchies, full republics, even socialist dictatorships. But the core toolset of running an empire never really disappeared. In the West, we still have roughly 1% of the people running everything, just like with an aristocracy. Then we get a few more percent of privileged people who are intimately tied to the top 1%. And then there is the 90+% peasant class who don't own any significant assets. Something is seriously wrong with our world today, and we can't understand and fix it by using silly socialism or traditional conspiracy mythology. Somehow the old ways of the aristocracy have survived and thrived. As it turns out, some aristocratic lines, such as Welfs, Vettans, and Reginars, were so big they could form their own family intelligence services. And for various purposes, they created modern conspiracy mythology to divert people's attention away and to destabilize rival countries. So-called conspiracy theorists market themselves as brave experts on organized crime and illegal intelligence operations without really being able or willing to think like professional investigators or intelligence analysts. As a rule, they are not even familiar with the extensive literature on the intelligence services of the 20th century and the historical research on the major empires. Among influencers, it is enough to know a few set pieces and use the well-known thought pattern. Every current incident, every hated policy can be traced back to the Illuminati and a conspiracy by Jews that has lasted for several hundred years, some say several thousand years. This means any amateur activist with an internet connection can supposedly solve virtually any case within 5 minutes. In the intelligence world, on the other hand, professionals laboriously collect information and the evaluators prepare reports for the elected politicians. Investigations are carried out in all possible directions, which can take years. People want to find out how things really are. If you ask historians, even those who specialize in intelligence services, they will say that there were no large state services before the 20th century. Zero. Because there are simply no files that could be evaluated. Researchers such as Professor Klaus Oberhauser from Austria have now realized that the empires of the time, such as Britain, did have serious structures. Oberhauser followed the trail of the British agent Alexander Horne and his connections to the first big best-selling conspiracy books. Files on this man were also found in the archives of the Foreign Office. The conspiracy authors, over the course of more than 200 years, simply wanted to dominate the field that historians had long avoided, to fill the vacuum with completely insane ideas that contradict every principle of the intelligence world. So, even all throughout the Middle Ages, there were different empires with intelligence capabilities, and they were battling each other a lot. When they were not conducting open warfare, they would hit each other with some very nefarious operations. The French king Philip IV already believed that there were conspiracies against him everywhere. British agents, some Jews, even high-ranking Catholic Church officials who did not want to pay the massive new taxes to the crown. Then even the Knights Templar. The French quarreled also for propaganda purposes with the House of Anjou-Plantagenet, which was very powerful at times and very devious. Later with the Welfs, Vettans, and Reginars. So these three lines are were the arch enemies of the French. The Habsburgs accused the Hohenzollerns and vice versa. The Catholic Vatican, which was controlled by the French for a long time, described dissenting Christian movements and later the larger rival churches as a conspiracy. The same was true of the Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment thinkers in turn believed that there were sinister Jesuit agents everywhere who jealously defended Catholic rule and were involved in the plot to blow up the British House of Lords. So, lots of operations that were going on. So, for a long time, Jews did not play any significant role in conspiracy media. It was all about the Catholics and the French and the British and this group and that group. At that time, there was a phenomenon which was called the court Jews. Now, this is when the aristocrats were recruiting some Jewish people to perform certain tasks, administration, some financial tasks, and helping with foreign trade and things of that nature. So it's perfectly clear that the aristocracies were running those Jewish people that they had recruited. This was a pretty simple affair. Now, why pick Jews besides some international connections and language skills and some other skills? Well, Jews did not have any significant rights. They were ranking lower than the average citizen who was already not well equipped with freedoms and liberties. Okay, so by controlling Jewish people, it was much easier to ensure loyalty, because if you picked someone, you could reward the entire local Jewish community, or you can also punish the entire local Jewish community. Now, this was done in a professional, very strict way. This was later then distorted by conspiracy books, which claimed that the aristocracy was stupid, and these few Jewish people were super smart, and they had all the intelligence capabilities in the world, and this is supposedly how Jews took everything over. This is not reality. So by reconstructing the past, especially the secrets of the past, we can see how the game was played back then, not too different from how any modern government would play that game. The infamous Rothschild family was recruited in the exact same way. This was originally the Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel, the mighty House of Hessen. They needed some new people, and they ran those people for generations. Now, of course, this court Jew phenomenon was severely distorted later on in conspiracy literature, claiming that the aristocracy was stupid, and these few Jewish people, they could just take everything over with nothing but a few loans and a courier system. This is complete nonsense. This is not how the world was at the time. The beginning of modern conspiracy media was after the French Revolution. The relatives of the British royal family controlled a number of smaller principalities, counties, and mini-kingdoms on German soil, which was the ideal situation for carrying out operations directed against France. The notorious Bavarian Illuminati order marketed itself as an Enlightenment group, but was ultimately just a front organization for the British aristocratic intelligence services. It is completely paradoxical to talk about Enlightenment, meaning the overcoming of old-fashioned aristocratic rule, when the most important members of the Illuminati were members of the high nobility. The Bavarian police seized membership lists and internal documents of the Illuminati, and to make matters worse, the information ended up in international newspapers and pamphlets. It was only a matter of time before suspicion would fall on the British Secret Services, which would have had significant consequences. Other pseudo-Enlightenment camouflage organizations, front organizations, and spirings might have been destroyed on German soil, and even the high nobility, Welfs, Wettins, and Reginars, could have gotten into a lot of trouble on German soil. The trip of the important Illuminati Johann Bode to Paris in 1787 attracted particular attention in retrospect. On this trip, Bode had long discussions with members of the Paris Lodge Les Amis Réunis and promoted the ideas of the Illuminati. It would be wrong to conclude that the Illuminati had the decisive influence on the French lodges and the French Revolution. The order's surviving writings are a kind of a stew of Freemasonry cliches about morality and human perfection, which should be achieved through a certain amount of subversion, but not too much of it. So, yeah, the order went bust. This had a significant fallout. A diversionary tactic was needed that would simultaneously protect the vast majority of the Illuminati members and describe the radicalization of the French lodges as a primarily French phenomenon. Within a very short time, a series of conspiracy books appeared in different languages and tailored to different target groups. Three most important conspiracy authors in the years after the French Revolution, Stark, Robison, and Baruel, all had a connection to the British scientific organization Royal Society from the high nobility. These three authors, just like a number of other authors from Illuminati circles, under pseudonyms avoided any investigation of traces that led to the British aristocratic secret intelligence networks. In 1794, the Duke of Braunschweig had a manifesto distributed to all Masonic lodges in which he told the story that conspirators from France had infiltrated Freemasonry and that it was precisely these nebulous conspirators who were responsible for the French Revolution. So nobody was talking about Jews, nobody was interested in Jews. This was all a battle with, the British and the French and all these organizations. So, then you had this guy, Ernst August von Goechhausen, who was a privy councillor of the Duke of Saxon-Weimar-Eisenach, published his Revelation of the System of the World's Citizen Republic anonymously in 1786, in which he claimed that there was a Jesuit conspiracy behind the Illuminati scandal. So he just simply blamed the Jesuits, and that was the whole purpose of this book. So yeah, Goechhausen was clearly tied to the same aristocracies that were members of the Illuminati, and he anonymously published a conspiracy blog blaming somebody else. And we had Karl von Eckartshausen, who was a member of Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati order, and was also considered a mystical theosophist. He anonymously published the pamphlet on the danger that threatens the thrones, states, and Christianity with total collapse through the false system of today's Enlightenment and the bold presumptions of so-called philosophers, secret societies, and sects. Yes, the book titles at the time were usually pretty long. He published this in 1791. Sounds pretty much like any standard truther out there, doesn't it? Right? It's this massive satanic conspiracy, subverting everything. So his stuff was translated into numerous European languages, especially French, Russian, and English. His most prominent reader was probably the Russian Tsar Alexander the First. I mean, it's pretty bold for someone who's not only a member of the Illuminati, but also in many ways an occultist, to anonymously publish a pamphlet in which he wants to teach the reader about conspiracies. So what made him an expert, right? I mean, he was tied to powerful organizations, and he distanced himself from the Illuminati afterwards, which was not unusual because the order was already busted. Then we had Johann August von Stark and Leopold Alois Hoffmann. Now, I'm guessing that you've never heard these names before, but these people created the modern conspiracy genre. Johann August von Stark was a German writer, influential Freemason, and at times general superintendent of Königsberg in Prussia. In 1811, he was raised to the nobility by the Grand Duke of Hesse, the powerful House of Hessen, right? These kind of circles. So you can imagine that the House of Hessen would have been extremely unhappy if he had dared to critically examine the role of the secret services of the Welfs, Wettins, and Regenars with regard to the French Revolution. He studied theology and Oriental studies at a Welfen University in Göttingen, and under Johann David Michaelis, fellow of the aristocratic British Scientific Association Royal Society, from whose circles the most important best-selling books of the conspiracy genre were increasingly published. So that was that guy. Then Leopold Alois Hoffmann was pretty much the same It was pretty much the same with him. Then we had John Robison. He was kind of the best-selling guy of the era. Renowned British mathematician, physicist. John Robison was professor at the University of Edinburgh, landed a bestseller with proofs of conspiracy, very popular internationally, and he was considered by subsequent generations of conspiracy authors to be a kind of early whistleblower, insider, and special expert on the subject. However, his revelations were a diversionary tactic, and he did not present any information that was not already circulating in Europe, because remember, the Illuminati order went bust. So everybody was talking about it anyway. And so both the Royal Society for Science and the Freemasons in Britain were vehicles for the British Crown to gradually transform the empire in the course of a fake enlightenment. Robison accuses the French of having interfered in Britain's colonial affairs, by which he means that France had sunk a fortune into the American War of Independence. Obviously. Yeah, so wouldn't it be interesting to analyze then if maybe the British, got their revenge against the French, by maybe supporting or inciting the French Revolution? But this is not the direction that John Robison is going. He does not want to blame the British system. He does not want to embarrass the British king. It's not about the truth in his book. Even more devastating for Robison's credibility is the fact that he had contacts with the British secret agent and diplomat Alexander Horn, who worked closely with the Thurn and Taxis family in Germany, which was close to the British crown. For example, Karl Alexander von Thurn und Taxis married the daughter of hereditary Prince Duke Karl of Mecklenburg and Friederike of Hessen-Darmstadt. The crown prince had none other than the English king George III as his brother-in-law, had served in the Hanover army and so on and so forth. And of course the Thurn and Taxis family was tied to the Illuminati order in Bavaria, because the Thurn and Taxis family is very big in Bavaria. Anyways, so Robison's declarations of loyalty to the British king and his social status, which was dependent on that same king, clearly show a direct conflict of interest. He was not interested in a scientific study of the subject, which could embarrass the king and his relatives on German soil. In 1776, Robison's name appears in the Minute Book of the Poker Club, an important association of the Scottish Enlightenment, formerly known as the Select Society. The extremely wealthy Sir William Pulteney was on board. The old William Pulteney was chosen by King George II as the first Earl of Bath. Robison became Secretary General of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and published the conspiracy book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, in 1797, just a few years before his death. So we suspect that his only concern was to draw attention to the French Freemasons and to pretend that there were no significant connections between the Illuminati order and Britain. So he could have published this thing under a pseudonym, but he chose otherwise. So he tried to create this contrast in the book by saying British Freemasons are awesome and they're not revolutionary minded and they're very nice people and it's all very orderly and cool. But these Freemasons in France are crazy, and some German lodges are crazy and bad, and he just wants to make that distinction very, very clear. The agent Alexander Horn, or intelligence asset, who is said to have collected the material for Robison, served in Regensburg, where the Thurn and Taxis family had resided since 1748, as a liaison for the British ambassador in Munich. So, yeah, so that's that. And of course, there's the fairly recent study of Professor Klaus Oberhauser about Alexander Horn and that whole intelligence network behind these conspiracy books. So a lot of espionage was going on in Bavaria, especially, and Mr. Horn was moving around in many different places, conducting many different operations. The young Adam Weishaupt, long before his wild Illuminati days, attended the Jesuit college in Ingolstadt until the age of 15 and experienced the stuffy, strict fanaticism there. At the same time, the orphan boy was adopted early by Johann Adam von Eichstätt and raised in the spirit of the Enlightenment philosophy. That goes back to a certain Christian Wolff. Wolff was a member of the British Royal Scientific Association Royal Society, lived for a time in the aristocratic stronghold of Hessen, taught at the aristocratic University of Marburg. So this is that guy's background. There's many more connections that you can find in my book. So the Princes Karl of Hessen and Ferdinand of Braunschweig, as well as the Dukes Ernst of Sachsen-Gotha and Karl August von Sachsen-Weimar, were members of the Illuminati order. And we can pretty much tell they were the most powerful members of the order. The Pope was not happy about the Illuminati. He sent 2 letters out declaring membership in the Illuminati order to be incompatible with the Catholic faith. In the foreword to his great conspiracy book, Robison explains that in his English homeland, when he was young, he had many harmless and rather boring experiences in Masonic lodges. But in lodges on the European mainland, he experienced things that, in his opinion, did not belong at all in the system of Freemasonry. So he praises the good and honest British Freemasonry on the one hand and condemns the dark, subversive lodges in Germany and France on the other. Robison says he visited lodges in the French city of Liège, Berlin, and Königsberg, where he was promised great progress in his Masonic enlightenment. However, the content offered in the promised new degrees were too irrational, too frivolous, too fanatical, too expensive, and too time-consuming for him. Many respected and influential men, on the other hand, pounced on every new trend, no matter how obscure, that was presented in the many new lodges. Across Europe, according to Robison, Freemasons increasingly indulged in strange and sensitive ideas that led to public malice and state and church censorship outside the lodges. So, for ordinary British Freemasons, it was an iron rule not to have critical discussions about the government, the church, and the lodge. Let us not forget that under British law, until well into the 1800s, even expressing intentions to harm the king was considered high treason. A conviction would have resulted in the person in question being hanged, castrated alive, and disemboweled. So that's that. So he tells a story like this: only a spark was needed to set the revolution in France in motion. This was just a situation, so there was nothing really else going on from the Illuminati, but there were some people, he says, that had some strange ideas. So there may have been something nefarious and secret, but he's distancing himself from that, and he's also distancing most of the Illuminati members from anything nefarious. Now, from an intelligence point of view, it took much more than a spark and favorable circumstances for a French Revolution, but rather long-prepared subversive operations and support from abroad. Instead of analyzing what had happened soberly and in terms of the intelligence world, Robison serves us a selectively prepared story. He taunts the corrupt French lodges and so on and so forth. So that's the only stuff that you get. That's the only stuff that you get in this book. Again, it's not about truth. It's about selling a certain narrative. John Robison added a special dedication to his conspiracy book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, a letter from William Wyndham, who served as Secretary at War and was an acquaintance of Robison's from their time together in Glasgow. He did not obtain permission from Wyndham for this. Not only was Wyndham a member of the Privy Council, whose members were often and we encounter in the midst of major espionage operations, but he first took a positive and then an extremely negative attitude towards the French Revolution. This would fit in with a strategy of first destroying the French monarchy and then fighting the new, internally divided French government. In 1793, Britain declared war on France and Wyndham became Secretary of War. He supported the royalist uprising in La Vendée and called on the British government to help the royalists with the aim of restoring the House of Bourbon to the throne. Right, so you can pretty much guess what was going on at the time. The British wanted to at least get the ball rolling in France and help with the uprisings in France, and then when France was in chaos, there was, then you saw conflicting or paradoxical propaganda from the British. So there was some of the propaganda was still calling for the abolishment of the monarchy in France, and the other propaganda was saying we should go back to a monarchy in France just to cause more chaos. So you can check out Professor Oberhauser's study on Alexander Horn. You can find more details about that in my book. This kind of espionage that was going on back then is pretty much the same as would happen in today's world. So then we had another multi hundreds of thousands of copies best-selling series. This was Augustin Baruel's memoirs. So while Robison served the Protestant and Masonic audience, Augustin Baruel, he was publishing his stuff for the Catholics, and that created a big wave. And there are many connections between Robison and Baruel. The two were integrated into the British Secret Service network, which was documented by researcher Klaus Oberhauser with many original sources. Baruel came from an old French aristocratic family, joined the Catholic Jesuits at a very young age, became successful as a journalist and writer before the revolution. Then he had to flee to Britain as a fanatical supporter of the old order. The scientist Jean-André Deluc suggested that Baruel should get in touch with important personalities, above all with Edmund Burke. Burke was an influential politician who served in the Privy Council, had initially praised the French Revolution when it was convenient for the British Empire. As soon as the hated French royal family was deposed, Burke changed his stance and publicly called for a reversal of the revolution, calling for more chaos and civil war in France. So this is kind of the background of Augustin Baruel. This was all a British campaign. So in volume 1 of the series, it's already noticeable in the first few paragraphs how Baruel dismisses the French Revolution as a terrible act of destruction by the cult of the Jacobins and Illuminati without even attempting to provide a sober classification. The French monarchy was backward and was exploiting the people like every other monarchy in Europe that wanted to inherit the fallen Roman Empire. It's ridiculous that right-wing conservative American circles eagerly adopted this extremely negative view of the French Revolution from Baruel, but at the same time viewed the American Revolution as, well, the founding of the U.S. Republic. So in volume 1, he gets into all the mechanics of the revolution. Back then, Baruel, of course, attacks the Protestant church, but he does not cast the slightest suspicion on the British. Of course not. Baruel's book series was basically designed to divide the population after the fact along political lines, religion, and social class lines. This becomes very, very clear. So then in volume 2, Baruel distinguishes between the wonderful, honorable British Freemasonry on the one hand and the evil occult lodges in France and Germany. It's the same story that we've heard before from John Robison. In chapter 9, he states, England in particular is full of highly decent men, excellent citizens who are Freemasons and are united in the bond of common good and brotherly sympathy. So, having gone into exile in Britain, Baruel must of course, needed to address this potential conflict of interest and assert that he is not putting the British Freemasons in a positive light simply because he fears negative consequences if he also dismisses these brothers as dangerous and occult. But, he was just playing the game. Baruel was an arch-Catholic Jesuit, and for that reason alone, he should reject all British Masonry, whether the regular 3-degree system or more advanced systems, which all refer to mystery cults of antiquity. He uses the simple argument that British lodges cannot be dangerous because they are very numerous and yet have not started a revolution like in France. British Masonry was conceived under King George I in 1717 and served various purposes, including a new system of favoritism below the nobility, sometimes parallel to the nobility. British society became more complex and loyalty, privileges, and obligations could be managed through lodges. You can create any kind of vehicle for secret operations, no matter how boring it may seem from the outside. Not just lodges with all the trimmings, but also anything else that you want. So then in volume 3, it's mainly about Adam Weishaupt, who supposedly wanted to bring about massive upheavals out of his own motivation. At the time, it was possible if you had a certain standing to create your own launch system, but you couldn't really create much change, without some very, very powerful connections. In volume 4, he just continues on. The Bavarian authorities finally stopped the Illuminati order after the embarrassing revelations, but refrained from imposing harsh punishments. The Bavarian censorship board consisted mainly of Illuminati members until the elector intervened in 1784. Enlightenment writings were often allowed, while anti-Enlightenment texts were repeatedly confiscated. Other parts of the Bavarian government were also already infiltrated by the Illuminati. Franz Xaver von Zwack, codename Cato, had actually been a royal Bavarian state councillor. He was transferred to Landshut as punishment and later fled to Paris, then returned to Bavaria. Weishaupt may actually have believed that he would play a central role, and he is said to have been suspicious that members Bode and Knigge were bringing high nobility on board, such as the Princes Karl of Hessen and Ferdinand of Braunschweig, the Dukes Ernst of Saxen-Gotha and Karl August of Saxon-Weimar, but maybe he was not really concerned at all. Ernst II used the Gotha Illuminati Lodge as a secret shadow cabinet even. Various Illuminati tried, in classic espionage fashion, to steal relevant secret government documents and exert influence on Bavarian policy towards Austria. The elector Karl Theodor had had enough and banned the order. Some lost their jobs, some had to leave Bavaria. There were some houses searched, but no one ended up in prison. In public, some tried to interpret the dissolution of the order as the work of Jesuit networks. Former Illuminati members published texts saying that it had all been a big misunderstanding. Adam Weishaupt fled. Duke Ernst II of Saxen-Gotha-Altenburg, also former member of the Illuminati, granted him asylum in Gotha. So the irony was not lost on many observers. The alleged enlightener who wanted to free the world from the yoke of absolutist rule took refuge with a powerful nobleman and was also financed by him. Yeah, this is how that went. So then, after this first wave of conspiracy bestseller books, the world changed in some ways and others. For example, you had the early beginning of industrial capitalism. You had bigger banks and we saw the first central banks even. Especially France had changed, and still the British tried to destabilize their enemy, their rival. Now, and this brings us to the next phase of conspiracy media, which was the early socialists. Now, socialist thought was also censored in France at the time, but they invented this technique or this trick. The early socialists in France, they would attack the government indirectly. So they were calling capitalism inherently Jewish and inherently parasitic, and talking about all this exploitation and kind of this underlying big conspiracy that they would allege that, this would all end very, very badly in the future. So this is kind of the next phase that we saw. The French had to invite foreign capital, for example, Rothschild money for a railway system, these kind of things. Banking became more important in general, and this is what these early conspiracy authors then used for their general attack on society. So, for example, we had Alphonse Toussenel. and his work, The Jews, Kings of the Age. Now, this was a socialist French journalist. He published his book in 1846. So the big topic is James de Rothschild, who was able to acquire the railway line from Paris to Belgium. Toussaint warned urgently that Jews would strive for world domination. There's a blanket complaint that in the new capitalism era, there is an individual price tag on everything. So if there had been no Jews in France at all, the same resentment would probably have arisen among the population, or the British would have also tried to destabilize France in the same way. Many people in France still worked as farmers or in small businesses and were unable to build up wealth, while wealthy circles divided up the various markets. And since only a few tens of thousands of Jews lived in France at the time, the average citizen did not know any of them or never met one. Still, with this propaganda, it was alleged that all this bad stuff that was happening, you had to pay for using bridges, you had to pay for using roads and rail travel and so on. The conspiracy books claimed that this was all the work of the Jewish conspiracy. So this is how the average person in France imagined, getting into contact with Jewish influence. So Toussaint could have just attacked capitalism instead of just calling everything Jewish. Then he would have sounded pretty much like Karl Marx of the same era. Did he really believe that greed was a characteristic that was specifically Jewish or more pronounced among Jews? That Jewish entrepreneurs did immoral things because of their Jewish religion or ethnic roots? Or was Toussaint's anti-Semitism more of a means to an end to stir up sentiment against bankers and the system itself? So it was kind of a legal loophole that he used to avoid censorship. In 1849, he published an appeal to the Paris workers to free themselves from Jewish despotism. The text accuses the Jews of worshipping a dark god. For Toussaint, this was just another way to stir up trouble. So this is kind of when socialism becomes more than just talking. This is when people take action, trying to bring down the system. So certainly some observers found it suspicious that a single bank had such dominance, like the Rothschild Bank, and that a British branch was involved. But the railway was hardly evidence of a Jewish world conspiracy. Everyone knew that the political situation in France was shaky and that theoretically a new government could nationalize private sector projects at any time. And that's what happened with this specific, the Nord Railway, ultimately. Then we had Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was a left-wing French economist, sociologist, one of the most important early socialists. His stuff is still popular. People still read that. He was very much against Jews, calling for banning Jews or destroying Jews. And as a child, Proudhon was unable to afford basic things like books or shoes for school. This is where the anger comes from. In 1840, he published his first work, What is Property? Famous slogan, property is theft. That was this guy. Then we had Edouard Drumont and his book about the Jewified France. So Drumont was actually a right-wing journalist who represented partly anarchist ideas, and he published his work La France Juive in 1886. Hundreds of thousands of copies were sold. There's also a German edition at the time. Drumont vaguely suggested that Jews and Freemasons were secretly controlling France. Since Freemasonry was already widespread, this was an easy way to tell a narrative, right? And of course, some Jewish bankers were becoming powerful. And so this is how this was concocted. Drummond preached a racial theory according to which Jews were seriously different from the rest of humanity due to their parasitic characteristics. Drummond even described the founder of the Illuminati, Mr. Weishaupt, as a Jew in order to imply that this conspiracy was behind the French Revolution. This was, of course, complete nonsense. In 1889, Drummond founded a French anti-Semitic league and a corresponding newspaper. And of course, that's already the time when this kind of stuff was becoming very popular in the right wing. Then we had Henri Roger Gougenot de Morceau, came from a noble family, was Chamberlain of the French King Charles X. In 1869, Gougenot de Morceau published the work for which he is still known today, the polemic Les Juifs, le Judaïsme et la judaïsation des peuples de chrétiens. More of the same. He believed that Freemasonry was a trap set up by anti-Jewish, by conspirators to recruit and manipulate Christians. In 1921, the prominent National Socialist Alfred Rosenberg translated de Morceau's work into German under the title The Jew, Judaism, and the Judaization of the Christian Peoples. So you need to understand, Gougenot de Morceau came from, aristocratic circles, or served the aristocracy. These families, they had exploited the people for centuries. It was not a long time ago, serfdom had officially ended in France, but still people were saying that exploitation was a Jewish characteristic and greed was Jewish, like they invented greed or something. So of course he goes into Freemasonry and traces it back to the Kabbalah, and he calls it totally Jewish, which is not really true, because when Masonry, or British Masonry, was created in 1717, they needed a door opener into the ancient world, right? And what's the most obvious thing to use? Well, some bits and pieces from the Old Testament. Just this became part of the Masonic ritual. And of course, if people took part in these rituals, they didn't necessarily think too much of it. Some people, especially the academics, the scientists, they were already fascinated with the ancient world. It was not uncommon to be interested in the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians. So some people, they were getting more and more into ancient mystery cults that have survived to some degree, but not every Mason was really interested in the ancient mystery cults. Gougenot de Morceau is giving us a bunch of old myths and legends. It's all kind of the same stories that have been floating around Europe for centuries. Some Jewish people kidnapping a child and that sort of nonsense. And then he tells a story that when a bunch of pandemics or epidemics happened, the Jews did not get sick, and that sort of nonsense. So this was kind of the old anti-Semitism. This was different than what the other early socialists had created and what the right wing then had adopted. The modern anti-Semitism is much more focused and tries to sound scientific, right? So they made a big shift in that regard. Then we had Mikhail Bakunin, also a very popular socialist at the time, he also hated Jewish people, blood-sucking people, collective parasite, he called them, which not only crosses the boundaries of states, but also the boundaries of political opinion. This Jewish sphere is now, at least for the most part, he said, under the control of Karl Marx and Rothschild. Yeah, well, whatever. Even Karl Marx was feeding into this conspiracy nonsense, right? So if you read his writings, he also describes capitalism as Jewish and parasitic, which is, interchangeable for him. Now, of course, Karl Marx had a Jewish background, but he just didn't care. He Really didn't care. And of course, he married an aristocratic woman from a very, very powerful family tied into, German or Prussian Ministry of the Interior, ties to Britain, so on and so forth. Very suspicious person, Mr. Karl Marx, but he was also feeding into this conspiracy nonsense because that was just en vogue at the time. So, then the right wing was copying all that stuff verbatim. They did not really have any new idea. I mean, they exaggerated sort of the racial conflict theory of history. But when it came to Jews and their idea of a world conspiracy, the right wingers basically copied from the left wingers. And so that was over the course of the 1800s. Then, of course, we had the Protocols of Zion. As a forged text from Russia around the year 1900. Not even a good forgery. Now, a good forgery actually reveals some real secrets, trying to sell some phony secrets. But there's nothing really in the protocols. And I mean, anybody who had the, anti-Semitic literature on his bookshelf, anybody could have pieced the stuff together. And the authors of the protocols were even plagiarizing some unrelated or other texts, so it was very, very lazy. And so there's nothing in it. Not a single secret is being revealed. It's just more of the same. And even the separation into different protocols is bogus because there's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's always the same stuff in every protocol. It's supposedly the plan to take over the world, like these conspirators talking to each other. This is what we're gonna do, but it's just fluff. It's just meaningless fluff that you could read in any conspiracy book at the time. So there's no real order and structure to these protocols because those who forged it were really, really lazy. But of course, this was turned into a phenomenon even by British actors and American groups. This unfortunately became a really big thing, and we had the International Jew. This was an essay collection. This was an essay collection published in 1920 with the help of Henry Ford. So this was kind of an extension of the Protocols of Zion, because the protocols were so terrible as a forgery. People always tried to add stuff to it to make it seem more credible. And we had Nesta Webster from the British establishment. She fed into this complete nonsense. She was from the establishment and she basically worked for the establishment. And she had some really significant help, which is not surprising. So Nesta Webster is pretty much like John Robison back in the day, or Mr. Baruel back in the day. So here you have again this contrast that we also saw before from John Robison. Webster described continental Freemasonry as sinister and subversive, while calling British Freemasonry an honorable association and supporters of law, order, and religion. She became the leading author of The Patriot, an anti-Semitic newspaper financed by Alan Percy, the 8th Duke of Northumberland, who was awarded the Order of the Garter, the Order of the British Empire, and some others. Freemasons of the United Grand Lodge of England supported Webster's writings. And this Alan Percy guy, the Duke of Northumberland, this guy also published an essay in 1930, The First Jewish Bid for World Power. So he was already into this. And so one of Webster's major works is Secret Societies and Subversive Movements from 1924. In the foreword, she immediately mentions how important John Robison's book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, and the works of Abi Baruel were. She discusses various historical secret societies and makes the claim that a Jewish group somehow managed to infiltrate secret societies and thereby gain great power on the European mainland. she's kind of retroactively changing even past conspiracy narratives by saying, well, the Illuminati were already kind of Jewish of some sort. That was kind of her game. She's alleging a secret intelligence service of the Jews that was much better than everybody else's. Even though Jews did not have a home country, so they had not the prerequisite for significant intelligence operations. I mean, you needed to be able to train your people, recruit people safely, make up false documents, create false identities, have diplomatic power. None of this was possible for Jews at the time. So Jews had a terrible, terrible position when it came to intelligence work. Pretty often Jews were forced into spying for the aristocracies. So that's how that worked. Webster tries to construct a Jewish plot after the fact, despite no relevant new information pointing in this direction. She mentions how the Duke of Braunschweig, member of the Illuminati, distributed a manifesto to all lodges in 1794, in which he told the story that very secret was told that very secret conspirators had infiltrated Freemasonry, that these conspirators were responsible for the French Revolution and various insurrectionary movements. I quote, 3 years after the Duke of Braunschweig distributed his manifesto to the lodges, the books by Baruel, Robison, and others appeared, which explained the whole conspiracy. Really? Really? I mean, how dumb do you have to be to fall for this nonsense? But apparently that nonsense was very, 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 very successful. So then came the German phase of conspiracy media. There you had Theodor Fritsch. This was in the late 1800s. Long series of anti-Semitic pamphlets. There was the first international anti-Jewish Congress in Dresden. And many publications like this. So, he published his major book in 1887, the Anti-Semitic Catechism, a compilation of the most important material for understanding the Jewish question. So this is a simple question and answer format, and explaining the sins of the Jews. And the reader is told that this is a short summary of hundreds of books on the subject. Quote, the Jews under the guise of religion are in reality a political, social, and business association which, guided by common instincts and in secret agreement among themselves, is working towards the exploitation and subjugation of the non-Jewish peoples. The Jews of all countries and all languages are united in this goal and work into each other's hands for this purpose. I mean, this is an explanation of nothing, really. Because there were so many powerful empires at the time, and even before that in the past, so many empires trying to use every available tool to gain power. Aristocracies using secret operations, secret networks to keep the power structure intact. Using businesses, political front structures, using anything they could think of, really. So it's just a very, very common thing that was used in Europe for a very long time. But in this book, it is said that, well, Jews kind of invented this strategy, or they are the masters of this strategy, really. Of course, the book talks a lot about the Rothschilds without actually giving away anything interesting. And so on and so forth. And then, of course, you had a bunch of German parties, the Pan-German League, the German Fatherland Party, the German Social Party, and they all took that stuff and ran with it. They all cultivated this big ideology. And it's interesting to note that these German territories, they were thoroughly infiltrated by certain aristocratic families, especially Welfs, Wettins, and Reginars. Now, the sublineages are named after the places they controlled, such as Hessen or Hanover, Mecklenburg, Thüringen, Saxon, and so on. So these aristocracies, they had spies everywhere. They could easily infiltrate the right-wing parties and the right-wing organizations and push this conspiracy nonsense. I mean, it's the same purpose as we saw with John Robinson's best-selling book much earlier. You draw attention away. You just tell people, well, there's nothing to see here. There's no secret stuff going on with these aristocratic families. There's very harmless, nice people. These aristocratic guys and their Masonic lodges. That's all nice and dandy. The big threat is the Jewish conspiracy. That's what they told people. So you're only supposed to focus on this mythological Jewish threat. Right, this is how they played, and of course, this became a big asset for the British strategy then for quite a while. Now, after World War I, the Germans were really angry, of course, because of course they lost the war, and now we know with more recent historical studies, Russia was actually the driving force behind World War I. Russia had dramatically increased its own forces, and they were getting ready for war. Everybody knew war was coming, and the Russians had a deal with the British and the French. Now, the Germans were in a weak alliance, for example, with the Austrians, and if you're in a weak alliance, you do not want war. This is kind of how the game is played in Europe. But when war became unavoidable, for the Germans, they started this propaganda drive. We were gonna win. Everything's gonna be great. But this was just standard propaganda. This does not mean the German leadership wanted that war, and this does not mean that they didn't know how dire the situation was, because they perfectly were aware of how bad Germany's chances were. But right at the end of the war, another propaganda drive happened, blaming World War I on the Jewish conspiracy. And of course, when the revolution happened in Russia, this also was painted as a Jewish conspiracy, in line with the other things that happened in the past, the French Revolution and this and that and the other. And of course, the Bolsheviks, the communists, they had recruited a certain number of Jews in Russia. These people were Russians, basically. And so they picked some Jewish people because they were more educated. They could be used for more complex tasks, but most of them were just removed later on after the revolution. But of course, it was easy at the time to claim that this revolution was part of that Jewish monster plot, really. But if we look closely, and I've done that, I've been doing that for years. If you look closely, you can find, of course, foreign influence, especially British influence, when it came to the revolution in Russia. For the most part, Russians did that to themselves. They did communism to themselves. So it's not really realistic, nowadays when they blame everybody else for it. And we saw that from Putin and others, saying that communism was forced onto Russia from the outside, basically. But the Russians did that to themselves. They mostly signed contracts with the Red Army and started to shoot other Russians. But then this conspiracy drive became even bigger and bigger in Germany in the 20s and 30s, blaming everything on the Jews. And of course, the Nazi movement then took over that ideology, and they thought they could understand everything, and they understand history, and they understand the intelligence game, which they of course didn't understand. Of course, this went all horrendously wrong. But after World War II, this conspiracy ideology was able to survive. It was still cultivated by various players, even the Soviet Union. They spread the protocols of Zion, especially in the Muslim world. Okay, so this is kind of a short overview of how that happened. You can find the long version in my book on Amazon.com, and there's also a lot of 20th century stuff in there. The modern conspiracy media, then the internet age of conspiracy media, right until the present day. So it's quite hard to reconstruct the past and the secret operations and networks of the past. This has to be done very meticulously, and there's some things we can't know 100% for certain, but the more data points we have, of course, the more we can get closer to the truth. Many empires in the past, many different intelligence capabilities. So when somebody is saying, well, the Jews did everything big, every important thing was done by this Jewish conspiracy, that means that influencer just does not understand history. That person has read standard conspiracy books, watched standard conspiracy videos, and it becomes a circular argument, right? They think they know it all. They think it's the perfect knowledge, and they can't fathom that somebody else isn't on board with this. So they will either assume you are stupid, or you're evil, or you're a coward, and this sort of becomes all of the activism. They will point at a Jewish person of some influence and say, well, here's proof for the big conspiracy. Well, it's not. You point it at a guy. You just have to tell us or explain to us how this all works according to your imagination. But of course, if you look at history, the conspiracy ideology isn't history. It's not. This is not how the world was. And then if you look into it, you also can find who was creating conspiracy mythology. It was actual intelligence services coming up with this stuff for various purposes. So check out my book on Amazon.com. You can find additional material on candorintel.com.